Although the prequel trilogy has been viewed as lesser in the eyes of casual fans of the Star Wars films, with their image being boosted around the time of the sequel trilogy's releases, the era they take place in is one of the most popular in the franchise, in part due to the Clone Wars series. However, this was not the first time that content beyond the films had expanded upon the gap between episodes 2 and 3. When the Clone Wars were first mentioned in the original film, it was made off limits for coverage by expanded universe content. Thus, most stories made between the trilogies, and even between in Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, were focused on expanding the journeys of the heroes from the original trilogy, along with introducing new ones and returning awfully new threats for them to face. This did begin to change as Lucas got closer to working on the prequels, starting with the Tales of the Jedi comics, although they were set 5,000 to 4,000 years before all the films in order to avoid clashing with how he would portray the Jedi in the prequels. Along with the comic series by Dark Horse set within the time frame of these new films, simply titled Star Wars, which would later become the Republic series. From the offset, this comic focused on Jedi that were background characters in the prequels, again likely to avoid clashing with Lucas's overall vision for the characters. Initially starting with Ki-Adi-Mundi and moving to Quinlan Vos. However, once the Clone Wars started with Attack of the Clones, the floodgates were opened for content set between it and Revenge of the Sith, in the forms of video games, TV, novels, and the aforementioned Republic comics and related miniseries, with the latter two examples being among the most common sources to expand on the conflict, and in a much more gritty way than in TCW. In most storylines from the comics, there were various Jedi who simply became cannon fodder as a way to demonstrate how devastating the Clone Wars were, and how Order 66 in Revenge of the Sith was essentially just Sidious performing mop-up. However, not all of these Jedi entered and left in the same issue, as there were several times where some from on previous eras of the comics, or even the films, reappeared, with even Jedi Masters like Oppo Rancisis and Adi Gallia being felled during the Clone Wars. The latter of which became one of Grievous's most notable victories, well, until this episode of TCW retconned it. On a similar note, certain Jedi who become recurring characters in this series were able to persist into later eras, often to be defeated by Vader or simply even clones in the Purge and Dark Times comics, but some like Kukruk were able to outlive the Empire. Another point about the Jedi in this series is how the views of those who opposed the Order's role in the Clone Wars go beyond just card-carrying villains, unlike Pong Krell and Barasofi in TCW Season 4 and 5 respectively. This is most clearly seen in the first issue of the Jedi miniseries, Jedi Mace Windu, where Windu attempts to prevent a schism between the Jedi, with each of those he speaks with having a separate reason for making a stand against the Jedi's actions. Kukruk stating that he had issues with sacrificing the clones under his command, something surprisingly few Jedi had in early presentations of the Clone Wars, while some believed that the Galactic Republic was corrupt, or that the Separatists had fair points in certain places, and one outright paraphrases Padme's statements made about the Clone Wars in Revenge of the Sith. Meanwhile, with Jedi from the films, the comics give most Jedi Masters time to shine, while also showing that even they were feeling the strains of the conflict in quiet moments, such as the end of Jedi Shaak Ti and the end of the Bounty Hunter / Show of Force storyline, from the main Republic comics. In the former, Shaak Ti speaks to Plo Koon about her doubts about the Jedi's place in the Clone Wars after a battle that takes place only a few weeks or months after the events of Munalist and Hypori from the 2003 Clone Wars series, while the latter ties into the events of the Shatterpoint novel. The latter story also focuses on Mace and his Revenge of the Sith B-Team, to show that, yes, they actually were skilled and competent, but just weren't the best suited for taking on a Sith Lord. Reinforced with all three of them, Saisi Tin, Kit Fisto, and Aegon Kolar, having semi-regular appearances to various extent within the comics and other pieces of Clone Wars media. Unlike the previous eras of the Republic comics, aside from the arc immediately before Clone Wars, the Clone Wars era of comics places a strong emphasis on Obi-Wan and Anakin. In the latter case, showing Skywalker's continued slip towards the dark side through the duration of the Clone Wars, which also acted as his own version of the Jedi trials, with him only being knighted 6 months before the events of Revenge of the Sith in this version of the continuity, making his outbursts about not being granted the title of Master even less justified from the perspective of Windu and the other Council Masters. Early on, the main aspect of conflict between the two was Anakin trying to maintain the various secrets generated by Attack of the Clones from Obi-Wan, or in cases such as the Camino arc. The most impactful story to Anakin's character is also likely one of the best-known parts of the Republic comics, the Battle of Jabim, which is the Jedi equivalent to the Embargo arc from TCW. Around midway through this story, Obi-Wan is believed to be dead by the other characters, despite having 2 layers of plot armour, prequel plot armour and main character plot armour, which leads to one of the few similarities between TCW and other Clone Wars stories, that being Anakin going dark-side crazy after being led to believe that Obi-Wan had been killed. However, due to having no one like Rex or Ahsoka to keep him grounded in this version of the scenario, who and with the few other Jedi that he was around with quickly being killed off one by one, or he gives in to his darker emotions more easily, with him discovering the power that would later become his signature move as Vader on the escape from Jabim, and to later being constantly passive-aggressive to the Tusken Raider Jedi Knight Asherad Het during a later battle, before briefly attacking him, even going as far to say to himself that he would redo the Tusken Raider vengeance scene from Attack of the Clones if given the choice. Unlike TCW, there is less of a focus on the clones themselves, choosing to characterise 1 or 2 clones at a time. The most well-known clone character from this era of Clone Wars content is Alpha 17, one of the first Dark Troopers, and although Fordo is my favourite clone from this era, Alpha has better established characterisation in his appearances. That characterisation being a trooper highly skilled and dedicated to getting the mission done through any means necessary, with his viewpoints often foreshadowing the approach the Galactic Empire would later prioritise, something done to help convey the slow slide from Republic to Empire that happens during the Clone Wars. Alpha was also intended to appear in TCW, but was eventually replaced in favour of Rex as a new character. Something I'm glad about, because Alpha's characterisation would have likely been heavily watered down like other expanded universe characters that appeared in the show. On top of that, Rex is my favourite Star Wars character, so that's another reason why I prefer the idea of Alpha remaining out of TCW. The other main character to get characterised was Commander Bly, second in command to Aayla Secura, with issue 68, Armour, being narrated through a monologue from his perspective of the events. My favourite aspect of this comic is the part near the end where he outlines his approach to dealing with orders, a perspective held by other clones with lesser levels of independence, such as Commander Fey, which effortlessly displays the way that clones were originally presented prior to TCW and to explain why most, if not all, regular clones immediately went along with Order 66, despite serving alongside Jedi for years, but leaving room for more advanced clones to be able to disobey it. Something also foreshadowed by Bly's interaction with Quinlan in the Siege of Seleucami arc, willing to accept going from the status of enemies to allies between the battles of Honagar and Seleucami, with the events of issue 68 also being a distant prelude to the Nogri aspects of the Thrawn trilogy. As one of the major villains of Revenge of the Sith, General Grievous was heavily incorporated into the multimedia project, with the 2003 Clone Wars arguably being his best appearance, while his pre- and post-Revenge of the Sith appearances were vastly different. In Revenge of the Sith itself, his characterisation can be justified given how it starts roughly a few hours after this happened to him, but the continuation of his Revenge of the Sith characterisation in TCW was one of the most insulting changes / retcons made by the show, with him going from someone who could take on Jedi Council Masters and imitate the martial arts aspect of Varpad, to someone who was defeated by Season 1 Ahsoka and later by Gungans. After being introduced in the 2003 Clone Wars, he got a comic miniseries dedicated to him, along with appearances scattered across other stories. Although the main problem I have with his specific comic is Yoda calling the plan to deal with Grievous as cowardice when the Jedi did equivalent missions both before and after to deal with fully fledged Sith Lords such as Revan, Vitiate, Bane, and later Sidious. Maybe because those examples were taking down the reigning Sith of the era, and most failed, but sending half the Jedi Council to take on Grievous would be for the greater good given the amount of Jedi he defeated in Legends. How he was able to fight 6 exhausted Jedi at once, including 2 Council Masters, and had cybernetics advanced enough for him to imitate Varpad to such an extent that it was effective against its creator, Mace Windu, as shown in the novel Labyrinth of Evil. On the topic of fighting Windu, in 2 out of 3 of the fights between the two, Windu chose to skip the lightsaber duel immediately and go straight to using aggressive force powers, with the comic example being in Obsession where he simply throws a stap at Grievous rather than fighting him, which demonstrates the skill of Grievous. One reason Grievous was so effective in his early appearances, in-universe, is that he always did his best to maintain the key traits that Dooku reminds him of during the original Clone Wars series, and how often he makes sure to have extra tricks up his sleeve in the event that he needs to retake the upper hand, as demonstrated once again in the Obsession comics in his duel with Adi Gallia, where, like at the end of the Battle of Coruscant in the 2003 Clone Wars, he activates his second set of arms mid-fight to win, whereas Revenge of the Sith and TCW Grievous just chooses the amount of lightsabers he wants to use and charges in without thought of ways he could use his cybernetics strategically. Although one moment where Grievous falls flat is the framing of this panel from Obsession where he and Kenobi have their backs to each other and somehow missed each other despite being a few metres away. As one of the main characters, and one of the most well-known from the Republic comics, Quinlan Vos gets a full arc and a primary focus in the comics side of the Clone Wars multimedia project. After a handful of his regular style of undercover missions, seen in issue 49 and Jedi Shack T, the majority of Quinlan's time during the Clone Wars is spent attempting to gain access to the inner circle of Dooku's dark acolytes, becoming obsessed with finding the Sith Master and denying his own fall to the dark side, only for Dooku to manipulate these traits within him and for his actions to become more and more extreme to fake his commitment. All of this culminates in the Seleucus arc, where he initially returns to the Jedi, only to attempt to trick both the Jedi and Dooku into thinking he was on their side while trying to get closer to the Sith Master, with the overall battle being on a scale similar to Jabin, and to one with a much higher impact on the outcome of the Clone Wars, with the Separatists' clone army being seen in this arc likely being used as an attempt by writers to fit in the pre-prequels perspective of the Clone Wars into canon to some extent. As the Jedi and clones throw themselves at the droids endlessly and on an individual level, Quinlan is forced to duel his former master before finally confronting Dooku through hologram, along with Sora Bulk, who he believes to be the Sith Master. However, Quinlan's true final battle in the last arc is against the dark side within himself, rather than the lightsaber duel between him and the last of the Dark Acolytes. Eventually, he chooses to leave the Jedi Order after the end of the Clone Wars due to his personal attachments to Colleen Hens, which had emerged during his mission, and had already come to the attention of his former Jedi Master, Tholm, unlike the way that Anakin's attachments turned out. After a brief look at what was to come in the Dark Times with the Vader-centric issue and the Into the Unknown storyline, the final 3 issues of Republic return to Quinlan Vos to show his perspective of Order 66. The start of the storyline is a relatively direct fight between the factions, for the first time in Quinlan's experience of the Clone Wars. However, he unfortunately took command of Opo Rancisis' forces and was thus stuck with Commander Fey as his second-in-command, a clone so single-minded that he makes Dogma from TCW look like an independently minded ARC trooper. In this story, Quinlan becomes part of the force that goes with Yoda to Kashyyyk. As a conclusion to the series, characters from previous eras re-emerge, with Tholm and Trassar surviving Order 66, and one of the characters from Quinlan's era of the Republic comics becoming a major element of the story. Although I have less context for him, or as I haven't read the previous comics that said character appear in. Initially, the Battle of Kashyyyk is presented as just another Clone Wars battle, or even a less dramatic one in comparison to others that appear, or in the comics such as Jabim or Seleucami. However, once Order 66 comes, everything is thrown into chaos for Quinlan, and as he barely survives his fate going for full overkill by ordering a Juggernaut tank to fire upon him. Although he's initially brought back to the brink of the dark side, he eventually chooses to go into hiding instead of trying to strike out at the Sith Lords, managing to successfully escape the clones, although barely, and return to fellow surviving Jedi and Colleen Hens. Although the impact of the peaceful ending for Vos and the other characters is somewhat nullified given how often the Empire fought against the Wookiees on Kashyyyk in both canon and Legends, making it the worst place for Jedi to be. As a positive, the time frame given by the ending seems to take place after the events of Dark Lord, the Rise of Darth Vader, so the characters likely avoided Vader's wrath in that case, and presumably in Force Unleashed's case. So yeah, that's the Clone Wars era of the Republic comics. I know Star Wars Legends can be daunting for people to get into when looking at it from an outside perspective, which is probably why I haven't made it more progress into it in the last 5 years. But if you're a fan of the prequel era, check out these comics. Either the Clone Wars era specifically, or earlier comics with characters such as Quinlan. Although, if you're a fan of TCW, who try putting it to one side because it is impossible to make them fit together without absurd levels of crowbarring, and if you look at it like that, you may end up disliking TCW. With the end of the year, thanks for getting me to 100 subscribers, along with the positive feedback to my Mass Effect videos, and getting in my Force Unleashed video to over 7,000 views. Meanwhile, next year I intend to make a video about Revenge of the Sith, specifically the novelisation, and I will most likely do a coverage video essay of the Clone Wars micro series, so stay tuned and thanks for watching.